In the middle of rural Louisiana sits one of the largest prisons in the United States, a former slave plantation turned penitentiary. For decades, Angola prison was more than a place of incarceration. It became a battleground over punishment, policy, and the limits of state power. Its death row drew national and international attention, not only because of the number of executions carried out in Louisiana during the late 20th century, but because of the conditions, legal challenges, and public scrutiny that forced the system to change. This is a historical investigation into how Angola became a blueprint and a warning for modern death row policy in America. This is not a story about spectacle. It is a story about institutions, courtrooms, and the human reality inside a system shaped by law, history, and controversy. If you enjoy real, gripping prison documentaries and true stories, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with your friends and family. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss more shocking and exclusive content. Angola, officially known as the Louisiana State Penitentiary, sits on thousands of acres of former plantation land along the Mississippi River. By the late 20th century, it had become one of the most recognizable prisons in the United States. Not because of myth, but because of its size, its isolation, and its role in Louisiana's death penalty system. For decades, every person sentenced to death in the state was housed here on a dedicated death row unit inside the larger prison complex. The concentration of cases, policies, and legal disputes made Angola a focal point in national debates about punishment and constitutional limits. To understand how Angola's death row gained its reputation, it is necessary to look at the historical context. During the 1980s and 1990s, Louisiana recorded one of the higher execution rates in the country relative to its population. Those years coincided with broader tough-on-crime politics, and expanding incarceration across the United States. Angola became the site where these statewide and national trends were felt most directly. The prison did not simply hold individuals under sentence of death. It became the administrative center for the state's procedures, appeals, and custody practices around capital punishment. At the same time, the physical and institutional conditions of confinement drew growing scrutiny. Reports from journalists, researchers, and civil rights organizations documented long periods of isolation on death row, limited out-of-cell time, and restricted access to programs compared to the general prison population. Cells were small, movement was tightly controlled, and social interaction was heavily regulated. Supporters of these policies described them as necessary for security. Critics argued they imposed unnecessary psychological and physical strain and risked violating constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. The tension between those two perspectives, security versus constitutional limits, became the foundation for decades of legal conflict. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, individuals housed on Angola's death row, sometimes joined by advocacy groups and attorneys, challenged aspects of their confinement in federal court. These lawsuits focused on specific, verifiable claims: exposure to extreme heat during Louisiana summers, insufficient recreation and mental health care, and conditions linked to prolonged isolation. Rather than abstract debates, these were fact-based cases built on records, inspections, and expert testimony. Those challenges did not eliminate death row, but they did lead to measurable policy shifts over time. Court rulings and negotiated settlements resulted in increases in out-of-cell time for some prisoners, expanded recreation opportunities, and changes to medical and mental health standards within parts of the unit. In some instances, the litigation influenced broader, statewide policy discussions about how people under sentence of death should be housed, moving the issue from a single facility to a statewide administrative question. As these cases unfolded, Angola's reputation grew internationally. Foreign journalists, human rights observers, and legal scholars cited the prison in discussions about American punishment practices. The attention was not driven by sensational stories alone. It was anchored in statistics, documented conditions, and the visibility created by litigation. Angola became a reference point, a place other states were compared to, whether as a model to follow, a cautionary example, or a contested symbol of American criminal justice. The historical significance of Angola's death row also lies in the way it linked local policy to national precedent. When federal courts evaluated conditions at the prison, they applied principles from earlier Supreme Court decisions on medical care, confinement, and the Eighth Amendment. That process connected the daily reality of a single housing unit in rural Louisiana to constitutional standards that shape prison policy across the country. The outcomes did not always produce sweeping change, but they added to a growing body of case law that future reformers, administrators, and lawyers would reference. Across these decades, Angola functioned as both a site of continuity and a site of change. The death row unit remained tightly controlled and heavily restricted, but the boundaries of what was acceptable under the Constitution shifted slowly through litigation and negotiation. The prison's administration adapted under court oversight at some points and resisted at others, reflecting the broader push and pull that defines American correctional policy. What makes Angola central to the story of U.S. death row policy is not a single dramatic event, but the accumulation of history. A high execution era that placed sustained attention on the facility, conditions that drew repeated scrutiny, and legal challenges that forced policymakers to confront the gap between long-standing practices and evolving constitutional expectations. Each of these elements, scale, controversy, and law, reinforce the others, helping transform a single prison into a national symbol. This chapter sets the foundation for the rest of the story. The next chapters will move deeper into the lived reality inside the unit, examine the key lawsuits and rulings that reshaped policy, and trace how Angola's trajectory influenced debates far beyond Louisiana. To understand the present and the policies other states still debate today, we first need to examine how a remote plantation-turned prison became a central stage in America's struggle over punishment, power, and reform. To understand why Angola's death row became the focus of court cases and national debate, it is necessary to look closely at daily life inside the unit during the years when scrutiny intensified. This chapter does not rely on stereotypes or speculation. It draws from documented accounts, inspections, testimony, and reporting that describe how the unit operated, the layout, the schedule, the limits on movement, and the policies that define the boundaries of everyday existence for people housed there. The death row unit at Angola was designed around control and separation. Individuals under sentence of death were housed in single-person cells, arranged along narrow tiers. Movement outside the cell was limited and supervised. Doors were controlled by staff, and every transition, from the cell to the shower to the recreation area or to medical care, followed strict procedures. Supporters of the system emphasized safety and predictability. Critics argued that the level of restriction created conditions of isolation that carried long-term psychological consequences. Cells were small, functional spaces meant to contain the essentials: a bunk, a toilet, and limited storage. Most daily activities occurred inside that space. Reading, writing, and correspondence were possible, but programming, work assignments, and social interaction were far more limited than in the general population. Out-of-cell recreation, when permitted, often took place in enclosed areas rather than large communal yards. Time outdoors varied across policy periods and court rulings, which later became a central point in litigation. The structure of the unit meant that sound, routine, and repetition shaped daily life as much as physical space. The opening and closing of doors, the scheduled counts, and the controlled movement of staff and prisoners created an environment built on order. For some administrators, that order represented stability. For others, particularly independent observers, it illustrated the degree to which confinement relied on isolation rather than engagement. Heat was another major factor. Louisiana summers are long and humid, and for years parts of the unit lacked effective climate control. During periods of high temperature, records showed interior heat readings climbing to levels that drew medical and legal concern. Prison officials cited operational and budget constraints. Attorneys and experts argued that prolonged exposure to heat created serious health risks, especially for prisoners with medical conditions or those taking certain medications. This issue became one of the most heavily litigated aspects of Angola's death row, producing court orders that required monitoring and mitigation measures in later years. Medical and mental health services formed another layer of debate. Access existed, but critics argued that the combination of isolation, limited movement, and stress required stronger support systems than those initially in place. Expert reports submitted in court cases raised questions about how confinement conditions intersected with mental health outcomes over long periods. These were not abstract claims. They were tied to records, evaluations, and interviews that gave judges a factual basis to evaluate constitutional standards. Communication with the outside world also followed strict rules. Mail, legal correspondence, and approved visitation provided connection, but opportunities were structured and supervised. Advocates argued that maintaining consistent, meaningful contact with family, attorneys, and support networks was essential to mental stability and fairness in a system where legal appeals could stretch across years. Administrators countered that security and logistics limited what could realistically be provided inside a high-security environment. It is important to note that Angola's death row was not static. Conditions evolved over time, shaped by leadership decisions, resources, and court oversight. Some policies became more restrictive during periods of heightened security concern. Others gradually shifted as litigation, negotiation, and external review identified risks or deficiencies. The result was a slow, uneven process of change, not a single turning point, but a sequence of adjustments that accumulated across decades. The people who lived inside the unit experienced these changes directly, though not always uniformly. Some describe the monotony and isolation as the most difficult aspect of confinement. Long hours alone, limited movement, and few opportunities for meaningful activity. Others focused on the uncertainty of the legal process, where appeals and rulings unfolded over years. Their perspectives often appeared in affidavits, interviews, and advocacy reports, offering first-hand insight, but filtered through legal and journalistic frameworks to preserve safety and confidentiality. Where images or depictions appeared publicly, they typically protected identity, silhouettes, blurred faces, and shadowed profiles, reflecting ethical and legal limits on representation. From an administrative standpoint, the unit represented a complex management challenge. Staff worked in an environment defined by high security expectations, constant procedural control, and legal scrutiny. Training, documentation, and compliance played major roles in daily operations. Every decision, from recreation time to temperature readings, could later be examined in court. That reality shaped institutional behavior, reinforcing caution, but also creating pressure to defend long-standing practices even when they came under question. International observers viewed these conditions through a broader lens. Comparisons with other countries' prison systems appeared in reports from human rights organizations and foreign journalists. These reports did not always align with the state's perspective, but they amplified global attention and contributed to Angola's symbolic status. The discussion extended beyond Louisiana, raising questions about how the United States defined punishment, security, and dignity for those under sentence of death. The significance of daily life inside the unit lies in how it connected to law. Conditions were not just lived, they were measured, documented, and argued in federal court. Temperature logs, medical records, recreation schedules, and housing policies became evidence. Judges evaluated whether those conditions met or violated constitutional standards, especially under the Eighth Amendment. In this way, ordinary details, hours out of cell, access to treatment, exposure to heat, took on national legal meaning. What emerges from this historical record is not a story of a single extreme incident, but a sustained pattern of confinement practices that gradually became the subject of structural reform. Angola's death row functioned as a controlled environment built around separation and order. Over time, external scrutiny questioned whether that structure balanced safety with constitutional responsibility. The result was a slow, contested shift toward policies that provided more recreation, better environmental safeguards, and clearer medical protocols, developments that later informed debates in other states. This chapter focuses on the lived reality of the unit because policy and litigation cannot be understood in the abstract. The next chapter moves into the courtroom itself, examining the key lawsuits, rulings, and negotiations that transformed Angola from a closed institutional space into a central test case for modern death row policy in the United States. The turning point in Angola's national significance did not happen inside a cell block. It happened in courtrooms, where conditions on death row were translated into legal arguments, expert testimony, and constitutional standards. This chapter traces the major themes of those cases, not as abstract theory, but as documented legal conflicts that forced the prison, the state, and federal judges to confront how confinement policies were justified, evaluated, and eventually changed. By the early 2000s, a series of civil rights lawsuits filed by individuals on death row began to focus attention on specific, measurable aspects of confinement. These were not broad, philosophical challenges to capital punishment itself. They targeted identifiable policies: prolonged isolation, limited recreation, extreme heat exposure, and access to medical and mental health services. Attorneys built their arguments around records, temperature logs, institutional policy manuals, and expert evaluations. Each case framed daily experience in constitutional terms, asking whether the conditions met the obligations established under the Eighth Amendment. One of the strongest areas of litigation centered on environmental conditions, especially heat. Louisiana's climate made this issue unavoidable. During the summer months, temperatures inside parts of the unit reached levels that experts described as medically hazardous for certain prisoners, particularly those with chronic health conditions or those prescribed medications that increased heat sensitivity. Plaintiffs argued that the state had a legal duty to mitigate those risks through monitoring, cooling measures, or policy adjustments. The state responded that security, cost, and infrastructure constraints limited what could reasonably be done in a high-security environment. Federal courts evaluated the claims through evidence rather than rhetoric. Judges reviewed temperature readings, medical records, and expert reports explaining the health implications of prolonged heat exposure. In several rulings, courts concluded that portions of the unit required corrective action. Orders and negotiated agreements led to changes such as increased temperature monitoring, access to ice or ventilation measures during extreme conditions, and adjustments to housing arrangements for medically vulnerable prisoners. These outcomes did not transform the unit overnight, but they established enforceable expectations and created a record other states would later reference when facing similar lawsuits. Another major theme in the litigation involved out-of-cell time and recreation. Plaintiffs argued that extended confinement in small cells, with limited opportunity for movement or meaningful activity, produced psychological harm inconsistent with evolving constitutional standards. Expert witnesses presented findings from clinical research and evaluations that linked prolonged isolation to measurable mental health effects. The state defended its policies as necessary for safety and order, emphasizing the high-security nature of the unit and the operational limits of the facility. Here again, the courtroom functioned as a place where policy was translated into measurable terms. Judges examined schedules, officer logs, and unit procedures to determine whether access to recreation and movement met constitutional requirements. In several periods, court oversight contributed to increases in recreation time, opportunities for limited exercise, and clear documentation standards. While these adjustments did not eliminate isolation, they reflected a shift from purely discretionary policy toward practices shaped by constitutional review. Access to medical and mental health care formed a third recurring area of litigation. Plaintiffs and advocacy groups argued that conditions of confinement combined with stress, uncertainty, and isolation required more robust support than originally provided. Courts evaluated these claims by reviewing medical files, staffing records, and expert assessments. In some cases, findings led to policy revisions, clearer treatment protocols, or formal monitoring requirements. These changes were incremental but meaningful, gradually aligning parts of the unit with standards applied elsewhere in the correctional system. Across these cases, one constant theme emerged. Documentation became central to governance. Every ruling reinforced the importance of records, temperature logs, medical visits, recreation schedules, and inspection reports. What once operated primarily as internal administrative practice became part of a public legal record, visible to judges, attorneys, and outside observers. That transparency reshaped institutional behavior. Administrators had to consider not only operational outcomes, but the likelihood that any policy might later be evaluated in federal court. The impact extended beyond Louisiana. Legal scholars, journalists, and policymakers began citing Angola's litigation in broader debates about death row housing nationwide. The cases contributed to a growing body of precedent that influenced how other states structured their units, documented conditions, and prepared for potential constitutional review. Angola was no longer only a place, it was a reference point in national policy conversations. These legal battles also revealed the tension between tradition and reform. Many of the challenge policies had existed for decades, shaped by security priorities and institutional culture. Litigation forced administrators to articulate, justify, and sometimes re-evaluate those assumptions. Some changes came through direct court orders. Others emerged through negotiated settlements, where both sides agreed to adjustments without conceding broader philosophical ground. The result was an uneven but undeniable trajectory toward greater oversight, clearer standards, and stronger procedural accountability. It is important to recognize what these lawsuits did not do. They did not abolish death row, eliminate high-security housing, or resolve every question about punishment and constitutional limits. Angola remained a secure facility, and the death row unit continued to function within a restrictive framework. But the courtroom process altered the boundaries of what was acceptable, narrowing the gap between long-standing practice and constitutional expectation. The symbolic impact was as significant as the policy changes. Through litigation, Angola shifted from a largely closed institutional environment to one of the most legally scrutinized death row systems in the country. Judges, reporters, and international observers examined the unit not as a distant abstraction, but as a site where law, policy, and lived experience intersected. That visibility reinforced Angola's reputation as both a blueprint and a battleground, a place where the rules governing death row confinement were tested, challenged, and gradually reshaped. The courtroom battles at Angola also reframed how debates about punishment were understood. Instead of focusing solely on ideology, they emphasized evidence, standards, and measurable outcomes. The question was not only how the state chose to punish, but how that punishment was administered day to day, and whether those practices aligned with constitutional obligations. Angola's story moved from internal policy to national precedent. The next chapter follows the ripple effects outward, how these rulings influenced reforms beyond Louisiana, shaped advocacy strategies, and contributed to evolving conversations about the future of death row policy in the United States. By the time Angola's courtroom battles produced measurable policy shifts, their effects were no longer contained within the boundaries of a single prison. What began as litigation over conditions in one Louisiana facility gradually became a case study cited across the United States in advocacy reports, academic research, policy discussions, and court filings in other states. This chapter traces how Angola's experience moved outward, influencing broader conversations about death row confinement, constitutional standards, and the future of high-security prison policy. The impact spread in part because the issues at the center of Angola's lawsuits were not unique to Louisiana. Many states with death row units relied on similar models of confinement: single-cell housing, tightly restricted movement, and limited access to recreation or programming. As Angola's cases produced rulings, settlements, and documented findings on heat exposure, isolation, and medical care, attorneys and policymakers elsewhere recognized parallels in their own systems. Legal briefs in other jurisdictions began referencing Angola as an example, either as a cautionary comparison or as evidence that courts were increasingly willing to scrutinize these conditions. Scholars and policy analysts played a key role in translating those developments for a wider audience. Articles and reports examined Angola's trajectory alongside trends in other states, identifying patterns in how death row housing was justified, challenged, and revised. These analyses did not present Angola as a single defining blueprint, but as one of the most visible and thoroughly documented cases in a growing national conversation. The prison became a reference point, not because it was identical to every other system, but because its history offered concrete evidence of how law and policy interacted over time. Advocacy organizations also drew from Angola's record when shaping reform strategies. Instead of framing debates solely around moral or philosophical objections to capital punishment, many groups emphasized measurable conditions of confinement, environmental safety, medical standards, recreation access, and the psychological effects of long-term isolation. Angola's litigation provided language, data, and precedents that could be adapted to other states' circumstances. The approach was pragmatic, focusing on verifiable conditions that courts were more likely to evaluate under constitutional standards. Administrators and policymakers followed these developments closely. Even in states not facing active lawsuits, prison officials monitored Angola's outcomes to anticipate potential legal exposure. Internal reviews and policy adjustments often occurred quietly, motivated less by public pressure than by risk management and professional responsibility. Some systems increased documentation, expanded recreation schedules, or implemented environmental monitoring programs as preventive measures. While not all of these changes were directly attributed to Angola, the influence of its legal record was evident in the timing and language of emerging policy revisions. International observers continued to amplify Angola's symbolic role. Reports comparing U.S. death row practices to those in other countries often used Angola as a focal example because its conditions, litigation history, and reforms were unusually well documented. These discussions did not always align with domestic perspectives, but they reinforced the perception that Angola represented more than a regional institution. It had become part of a global conversation about punishment, human rights, and the limits of state authority. The ripple effects also reached law schools, judicial education programs, and professional trainings. Case summaries from Angola's litigation appeared in seminars on constitutional law, corrections management, and public policy ethics. Students, administrators, and legal practitioners studied the rulings not just for their outcomes, but for the reasoning behind them, how judges weighed evidence, how expert testimony shaped findings, and how constitutional standards evolved through incremental decisions rather than sweeping declarations. Yet the spread of Angola's influence did not produce uniform change. States differed in political climate, administrative philosophy, and resource capacity. Some embraced reform more quickly, adopting structured recreation programs, clearer housing policies, and expanded mental health services. Others resisted or modified changes only under direct court oversight. The result was a patchwork landscape, evidence of progress in some areas, persistence of older practices in others. Angola's legacy, in that sense, was not a single model imposed nationwide, but a catalyst that accelerated debate and forced institutions to confront questions they could no longer ignore. The conversation also extended beyond death row itself. As courts and policymakers examined confinement standards for people under sentence of death, similar questions emerged about long-term isolation in other high-security units. Advocates and researchers drew parallels between death row policies and restrictive housing for non-capital prisoners, arguing that constitutional concerns, especially around environmental safety and mental health effects, were relevant across custody levels. Angola's litigation contributed indirectly to this broader reassessment by demonstrating how detailed documentation and expert evidence could reshape institutional policy. At the same time, Angola's story highlighted the limits of reform through litigation alone. Court rulings could require changes to specific practices, but they could not resolve every structural issue in the system. Resource constraints, institutional culture, and political priorities continue to shape outcomes. Some reforms moved slowly, others stalled, and some are implemented unevenly. The legal process created accountability, but did not eliminate the fundamental tensions between security, cost, and constitutional responsibility. Those tensions also influenced public perception. Media coverage of Angola's reforms sometimes framed them as evidence of progress. Other accounts emphasized how gradual and contested the process remained. The historical record supports both views. Meaningful improvements occurred, but only through sustained pressure, detailed evidence, and years of negotiation and oversight. The gap between aspiration and implementation was a defining feature of the reform process itself. Still, Angola's national relevance rests on one clear fact. It transformed the conversation about death row policy from a closed institutional matter into a subject of public, legal, and academic scrutiny. The prison became a site where questions of punishment were grounded in documentation rather than assumption. That shift toward evidence-based evaluation shaped how other states prepared for litigation, how advocates built reform strategies, and how judges interpreted constitutional obligations. In that sense, Angola functioned as both a precedent and a mirror. Other systems saw in its story a reflection of their own vulnerabilities and a roadmap for what might follow if conditions went unexamined. The reforms that emerged did not erase controversy or settle national debates about capital punishment, but they helped redefine the standards by which high-security confinement is judged, and they demonstrated that institutional practices, once considered fixed, could be challenged, measured, and changed over time. Angola's story does not end with court rulings or policy adjustments. Its legacy continues to shape how death row confinement is debated, studied, and governed across the United States. This final chapter looks at what that legacy means today, the unresolved questions, the contested interpretations, and the continuing tension between security, constitutional limits, and public responsibility. Angola remains a working prison, one of the largest in the country, and its death row history is now part of a broader institutional identity shaped by litigation, reform, and ongoing oversight. Some observers view the changes that emerged from decades of legal scrutiny as evidence of progress. Clearer policies, better documentation, and stronger environmental and medical safeguards than in earlier periods. Others argue that the reforms did not go far enough, pointing to the persistence of restrictive housing, limited movement, and the psychological strain associated with long-term separation from the general prison population. That divide reflects a deeper disagreement about what death row confinement should be. Supporters of strict security models emphasize risk management, staff safety, and institutional stability. They argue that the structure of high-security housing exists to prevent disruption and maintain order in a complex correctional system. Critics counter that security can be preserved without relying so heavily on isolation, and that constitutional standards, as interpreted through decades of litigation, require ongoing reassessment rather than static policy. In practice, Angola's legacy is visible in the balance between those perspectives. The prison operates under a framework shaped by court expectations and administrative procedures that did not exist in the same form decades earlier. Environmental monitoring, recreation schedules, and medical protocols are now documented in ways that make compliance measurable. At the same time, the unit remains restrictive, and many of the core features of death row custody, controlled movement, separation, and tightly supervised access, continue to define daily life. Researchers studying Angola's trajectory emphasize that change in correctional systems is rarely dramatic or immediate. Instead, it occurs through gradual shifts, policy memoranda, revised procedures, incremental adjustments prompted by audits, reports, or judicial feedback. Angola's history illustrates that process clearly. The most significant developments were not sudden reforms, but cumulative changes that reshaped expectations over time. That gradual evolution is part of what makes Angola central to national policy conversations. It demonstrates how institutions adjust when legal, ethical, and operational pressures converge. Angola's legacy is also preserved through documentation. Court records, expert reports, and investigative journalism created a detailed public archive of conditions, policy debates, and administrative responses. Few death row systems in the United States have been examined as extensively. That visibility means Angola now functions as a reference point for future evaluations, a historical record that lawmakers, attorneys, and administrators continue to cite when assessing new policy proposals or reviewing emerging litigation in other states. Public perception adds another layer to the story. To some viewers, Angola represents a symbol of state power and strict punishment. To others, it stands as a case study in institutional accountability and the limits of confinement policy under constitutional law. Both views draw from the same historical record, but emphasize different aspects. One focuses on security and authority, the other on oversight, reform, and human impact. The coexistence of those interpretations highlights why Angola remains a subject of continuing debate rather than a closed historical chapter. International attention has also persisted. Observers outside the United States continue to analyze Angola in discussions about comparative punishment systems, institutional reform, and the role of litigation in shaping correctional policy. While international perspectives differ from domestic ones, they reinforce the idea that Angola's significance extends beyond state or national boundaries. The prison's history has become part of a global conversation about how democratic societies reconcile punishment with constitutional responsibility. Even with decades of documentation, important questions remain unresolved. How should states balance security concerns with mental health risks associated with long-term restrictive housing? What level of environmental protection, particularly concerning heat, ventilation, and medical vulnerability, should be considered constitutionally required rather than administratively optional? And how should policymakers assess whether reforms have produced meaningful change or simply adjusted procedures without addressing deeper structural issues? Angola's history does not provide final answers to those questions, but it does provide a framework for evaluating them. The record shows that conditions can be measured, policies can be reviewed, and institutional assumptions can be challenged through evidence rather than speculation. It also shows that reform requires sustained attention, monitoring, documentation, and a willingness to adapt as legal standards evolve. For many analysts, that may be Angola's most enduring lesson. Prisons are not static environments. They reflect broader political, legal, and social forces, and they change slowly, unevenly, and often only under pressure in response to those forces. Angola became a symbol because its policies were tested repeatedly in public, in court, and across decades. The story demonstrates how a single institution can influence national debate, not through dramatic events, but through accumulated records, contested interpretations, and the gradual reshaping of expectations. Today, Angola continues to occupy a complex place in American criminal justice history. It is remembered as a site of controversy, litigation, and reform, a place where the boundaries of death row confinement were challenged and redefined. It is also remembered as an institution where those changes unfolded inside an operating prison, under real constraints, with outcomes that were partial, negotiated, and constantly subject to review. The legacy of Angola's death row is therefore neither purely symbolic nor purely practical. It exists in policy manuals, legal precedents, and administrative procedures, and in the continuing debate over what confinement should look like for people under sentence of death. That debate remains active, shaped by history, but not limited by it. Angola's past informs the present, and its record continues to guide how states evaluate the relationship between punishment, law, and responsibility. As long as those questions remain unsettled, Angola's story will remain relevant, not as a closed chapter, but as an ongoing reference point in the evolving struggle to define the limits of state power inside the walls of American prisons.